Welcome to the launch of the 2025 Global Multidimensional Poverty Index report. I'm Pedro Conceição. I'm the director of the Office, Human Development Report Office at the United Nations Development Program. And it's now the 7th time that we have collaborated with the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative to present to the world a different way of looking at poverty. We look at poverty in a way that goes beyond income, that goes beyond money, and at the ways in which people are deprived by looking at whether children are able to go to school, whether they are malnourished or not, the extent to which people have access to water and electricity, to try to capture the lived reality of the many people that remain deprived around the world. So today we're going to have a presentation of the main findings of the report, followed by a discussion on the implications of these findings, their relevance, and what they mean in today's world. But before that, we're going to hear from the acting administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Hao-Liang Xu.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today's discussion on the 2025 Multidimensional Poverty Index report, or MPI, launched by the United Nations Development Program and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. On this International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, this year's findings reveal a global development emergency. They show how poverty is no longer a standalone socio-economic issue. It is deeply interlinked with planetary pressures and instability. Our report shows that nearly 80% of the world's multidimensionally poor, 887 million people, live in areas exposed to at least one of the 4 key climate hazards: high heat, drought, floods, or air pollution. Even more troubling, some 650 million poor people face 2 or more hazards at the same time. This unequal burden is heavily concentrated in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and expected to intensify globally in the future. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this new MPI matters because it allows us to see poverty as people live it, compounded by climate risk and inequality. Confronting this crisis requires solidarity, cooperation, and financing for global public goods, from resilience to social protection. As we look to COP30 in Brazil, we must carry forward that message of hope and cooperation. For 887 million lives are not a statistic, they are a call to action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hao-Liang. So Hao-Liang already alluded to 2 important findings and messages of the report. One is the sheer scale of the number of people living in poverty, 1.1 billion people. This is equivalent to the entire population living in the Americas. Just think about that for a moment, the scale that we're talking about here. And secondly, Hao-Liang also referred to the thematic focus of the report, which is about this idea of overlapping deprivations and climate hazards. Now, to hear about the findings of the report in more detail and depth, I'm going to hand over to Sabine Alkire, the director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative and our partner, followed by my colleague Malika Dahingia, who was one of the colleagues in the Human Development Report Office that collaborated closely with the OPHI team in producing this report. So Sabine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pedro. It's very good to have all of you here and to share these results. As Pedro said, the report focuses on overlapping hardships between climate and poverty and climate hazards. But first, we'll start by asking, what is global multidimensional poverty? What's its scope this year? And we start with the people that Hao Lianzhu mentioned. In this case, a family from Ricardo and Susana in the Guarani indigenous community in Bolivia. And we ask which of the 10 deprivations covered by the global MPI they experience. Is anybody undernourished? A child has died. Nobody has 6 years of schooling. A child is out of school. They lack clean cooking fuel, adequate sanitation, safe drinking water, electricity, durable housing, and assets. The dimensions of health, education, and living standards are equally weighted as are indicators within each dimension. And this family is job insecure. They have sanitation, but it's shared by 19 household members. But nobody has 6 years of schooling. All the children are out of school, and they lack clean cooking fuel. So their deprivation score is that they are deprived in 38% of the deprivations. And that's more than 33%. If they're deprived in 33% or more, they're multidimensionally poor. The global MPI measures multidimensional poverty in an acute form across 109 countries and 6.3 billion people, using multiple indicator cluster survey data for 51 countries, demographic and health surveys for 44, and national surveys for 14. We updated 13 estimates this year, and we show trends for 88 countries, and disaggregations are available throughout. We find that of those 6.3 billion people, 1.1 billion are poor. And this year, we find that 51% of poor people are children under the age of 18. 27.8% of children are poor, and 13.5% of adults. People ask us why we always mention that number, because it hasn't changed. It's not interesting. But there are lives behind those numbers, and we must eradicate poverty for children and continue to remember it. Across all of the 10 indicators, each is important, but the highest deprivations, the most number of people affected by poverty and deprivations, are in cooking fuel, sanitation, housing, and undernutrition. But still, over half of the poor people cannot turn on a light. They do not have lack access to electricity, and they have nobody in their household with 6 years of schooling in our information and technology age. Poverty is most prevalent in low-income countries. 61.2% of people are poor in those countries, and they remain rightfully a priority. But if we take a perspective that each life matters, then we want to look where poor people live. And actually, 740 million people, nearly 2/3 of all poor people, do not live in low-income countries. They live in middle-income countries. And so this area needs to be addressed. Every poor person in East Asia and the Pacific, every poor person in Latin America, Europe, and Central Asia, and everyone in South Asia, except those living in Afghanistan. All these poor people are in middle-income countries, as are 40% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa who are poor. We're not going to end poverty without looking at middle-income countries and investing in them. And middle-income countries, again, are green in this chart, and the low-income countries are red, and it's showing the number of people who are poor and deprived and where they live. And what you can see is that across the board, a large proportion of deprivations in every indicator are from people living in middle-income countries. Only in electricity and drinking water are deprivations higher in terms of the percentage and the number of poor people in low-income countries. The global MPI gives a regional picture where poverty is highest in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by South Asia. 83% of poor people live in those two regions, and then Arab states. But it also gives national figures. So for example, in Africa, it ranges from 1% in Seychelles to 84% in Chad. But subnationally, we look at the regions of Senegal, where it ranges from 12.9% in Dakar to 85.8% in Kaffrine. The global MPI is also broken down by rural and urban areas, by gender of the household head, as well as by age cohort. And each group has their indicator composition of poverty, the face of poverty. So you can see what to do to reduce deprivations of poor people. How does this differ from monetary measures? In this slide, the height of the yellow and red bars is the percentage of people who are multidimensionally poor, and the dot is the percentage who are monetary poor by the $3 a day World Bank poverty measure. And you see there are differences. For example, in Chad, Guinea, Mauritania, and Sudan, multidimensional poverty is 40 percentage points higher than monetary. Those are the four green dots on the right-hand side on the yellow area. But if you look at the red dots above the bars, these are countries where monetary poverty is 20 percentage points higher than multidimensional. We need both measures to get a good view of poverty and to be able to address it cost effectively. We studied trends in poverty for 88 countries, 5.6 billion people, and 76 of them had a statistically significant reduction in at least one region. Of the 20 fastest countries to reduce poverty in absolute terms, 8 are low-income countries and 12 are middle-income countries. 15 countries reduced poverty in every single subnational region. 11 countries reduced every single indicator statistically significantly. So we are looking at many possibilities of success and many examples of success through the years. But if we look at data that start in 2018 or later and end in 2021, 22 or later, so spanning the pandemic and more recent, we cover 91 subnational regions. How many of them have reduced poverty? 6 out of 91. So we're worried about a stagnation in poverty reduction on this International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. The global MPI covers billions of people, but we also must look at small island developing states, or SIDS. We cover 22 SIDS, home to 57.6 million people, and we updated data for Nauru and Vanuatu this year. And across these SIDS, 23.5% of people are MPI poor, and that's greater than the global average of 18.3%. But it varies. In Cuba, Maldives, Seychelles, Tonga, Trinidad and Tobago, less than 1% of people are poor. But it's over 40% in Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, and Timor-Leste. But also within the small island developing states, there's disparity. For example, in Guyana, where 1.8% of people are poor, subnationally it's 0.1 to 23%. And in all SIDS except Cuba and Seychelles, children are poorer than adults. We want to profile and understand the situations in SIDS because they are acutely susceptible to climate hazards. And that is the topic which Malika will now share with you.
Thank you, Sabina. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Every year, the Global MPI report, in addition to presenting the updated estimates for global poverty, it also puts a spotlight on a thematic topic that is of significant relevance. And this year, as Pedro and Sabina earlier mentioned, we focus on climate hazards. And as we can all agree, the need to study poverty and the climate crisis together has never been greater. Poverty is closely linked with the climate crisis. Climate hazards can affect people's livelihoods, their health outcomes, And as these hazards continue to grow in intensity and frequency, examining how they intersect with poverty is not just essential, but also urgent. With that context, the 2025 Global MPI report for the first time brings together data on climate hazards and multidimensional poverty. We try to assess how many poor people in the world live with this added burden of climate hazards, and which geographies or contexts are these poor people concentrated in. We focus on 4 key hazards: high heat, drought, flood, and air pollution. We overlay this climate hazard information with the data on poverty at the subnational level, which allows us to use a level of granularity that goes beyond the national estimates. And this overlaying is done for the MPI survey year for each country, which lets us understand the concurrent experiences of poverty and the 4 different hazards during one specific year. Now, we find that an overwhelming majority of poor people, around 80%, live in regions that are exposed to at least one of the 4 climate hazards assessed in this study. This 80% represents 887 million poor people across the 108 MPI countries that we've studied. And when we break it down by the type of hazards, the largest number of poor people we find are exposed to high heat, covering 608 million poor people. This is closely followed by air pollution, which claims 577 million poor people. Now, relatively fewer number of poor people are exposed to floods and droughts, as you can see in this chart, 465 and 207 million, but these are still significant numbers warranting concern. But as we look beyond these global totals, we do observe interesting trends. There is significant heterogeneity across geographies in how poverty and climate hazards overlap. The maps here illustrate this heterogeneity. Each map presents the number of poor people who are exposed to the 4 specific climate hazards. The shades of pink and maroon represent regions that are exposed to any of these hazards. And as we move from lighter to darker shades of pink or maroon, we move from a lower to higher number of poor people living with the climate hazard exposure. And as is evident from these visuals, this poverty climate hazard overlap that we are inspecting, it varies by geographies, and this variation also differs across the 4 different types of hazards. For example, for high heat, we find that much of West Africa has a strong concentration of poor populations. Similarly, large parts of South Asia also experience this acute combination of poverty with exposure to high heat, floods, and air pollution. Many other subnational regions of the world in East Asia and Latin America also show significant overlaps, which really drives home the fact that this truly is a global challenge and it is not confined to just a few regions. But the story doesn't just end with single hazards. Many multidimensionally poor people face not just one, but several within the same time period. Around 651 million, which is about 60% of the total poor people, are exposed to 2 or more climate hazards, while 309 million poor people are exposed to 3 or 4 hazards concurrently. And when poor people are faced with these concurrent shocks, in most cases, it represents the most severe form of climate stresses, given that multidimensionally poor households typically have the fewest assets, weakest coping capacities, and least access to social protection services. But this distribution of concurrent hazards is also far from even across geographies. This chart here shows the number of poor people who are exposed to different number of hazards in the same year. And as you can see, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa have the largest share of poor people living in exposure to at least 2 or more hazards. In South Asia, in fact, 90% of the total poor are exposed to 2 or more climate hazards during the same year. And this pattern is particularly troubling when we try to zoom into some of the poorest countries in the world. For example, in Niger, which is one of the poorest countries according to our global MPI, every subnational region experienced at least 2 climate hazards during the MPI reference year. But beyond regional patterns, important differences also emerge when we examine exposure through the lens of country income groups. We find that lower middle income countries bear the heaviest burden, they account for the largest share of poor people exposed to at least one climate hazard. It covers an overwhelming 548 million poor people. And a large number of these people are exposed to two or more hazards at the same time. In low-income countries, exposure levels are again substantial, as you can see from this graph, although fewer poor people face multiple concurrent hazards. Upper middle-income countries, on the other hand, have fewer poor people overall, as was also highlighted in the presentation by Sabina, yet their exposure to climate hazards remain high. The 93 million poor people who are exposed to any hazard, as you can see in this chart, that 93 million represents 91% of the total poor living in these country contexts. But these disparities in the number of hazards, of course, only tell us a part of the story. The composition of exposure or the type of climate hazard exposure can help us further identify which type of vulnerabilities are likely most acute across these income groups. And what we find is that high heat, air pollution, and floods are driving up the numbers in lower middle income countries. High heat and air pollution, in fact, have around 70% exposure each. Low income countries also face substantial exposure, but to a lesser extent. Air pollution levels are relatively lower in low income countries compared to the two middle income country contexts. And this is likely because industrial activity, urbanization, transportation, etc., which all increase with income, tend to drive higher pollution levels in the middle income settings. Now, our findings till now have described today's challenges. The next question is, what lies ahead? How might these climate risks evolve over time? And what does it mean for the multidimensionally poor people of today? So with that context, in this report, we analyzed temperature projection data from two future time periods, mid-century, which covers 2040 to 2059, and end of century, which includes 2080 to 2099. The chart here presents the additional number of high heat days in these two future time periods for countries with low to higher levels of poverty. And what we see is a very clear gradient. The countries with higher levels of poverty are expected to face much greater increase in the number of hot days each year, up to 92 days in a high emissions scenario. And juxtapose that with what is projected for the countries with lowest poverty levels, we find that the countries with the least MPI values, or the ones with lowest poverty levels, are projected to experience an additional 62 high heat days per year. While 62 is still a substantial increase, but evidently much lower than what is projected to be seen for high poverty countries. These projections point to a clearly troubling divergence. Poorest countries that are often least responsible for global emissions are expected to bear the greatest heat burden in the future, which will likely compound existing vulnerabilities and potentially make sustained poverty reduction even more difficult. So to conclude, our 2025 Global MPI report shines light on this double burden for people and planet that we can no longer ignore. We find that an overwhelming majority of poor people today live in exposure to climate hazards, and majority of these people do not experience just one, but multiple hazards at the same time. This really highlights the need to situate these two challenges of poverty reduction and climate crisis in the same narrative. These are interlinked issues that can benefit from integrated strategies and solutions. Second, we find that lower middle income countries face a severe combination of poverty and climate hazards. And this is especially important when we consider that many poor communities in these country contexts usually depend on fragile ecosystems for their food, water, and livelihoods. And finally, the double burden of poverty and climate hazard that we observe, it is not limited to the present alone, but it is expected to intensify in the future. So we need to move from recognition to rapid action. Thank you. I will now pass it on to Sabina for some parting thoughts.
We just wanted to conclude by recognizing that the Global MPI is the work of many hands, technical teams with great attention to detail, researchers, writers, communication design, and events teams. So we want to acknowledge and thank you for all your work in bringing this work out. But we also want to thank you, our esteemed audience, for your commitment, for your expertise, and for your own work on these areas. We hope that this data and the report will strengthen the work that you do to address poverty and climate hazards strongly and together.
Thank you so much, Sabina, Malika, for this wonderful presentation. The findings are sobering, and we're now going to have a conversation, a dialogue with you, Sabina, but others are going to join us to reflect on the findings of the report. So I will introduce them as I invite them to share their thoughts on the report. And I will start with Carlos Manuel. We have two Carlos, so I have to specify which one I'm addressing, who is the head of the Global Environment Facility, which is perhaps one of the most important instruments that the international community has devised to help us to address global environmental challenges. And Carlos Manuel, I'll invite you to say perhaps a few words about the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, as you address my question. But I wanted to invite you to reflect on the point that it's actually in middle-income countries or lower middle-income countries that we see a higher incidence of both multidimensional poverty and exposure to a number of hazards. So I don't think it's surprising. It's widely known that many poor people live in middle-income countries, in part because of the size of the countries that compose this category. But I think it's surprising to realize that about half of the poor people in lower middle-income countries are exposed to at least three or more of the hazards that we've identified, compared to less than 10% in lower middle-income countries. So maybe say a few words about the GEF, Carlos Manuel, and reflect on this particularly intense overlap of poverty and climate hazards in lower middle-income countries.
Oh, my pleasure, Pedro and Sabine. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm the CEO of the Global Environment Facility, the largest fund on planet Earth that nobody knows about it. And this is the way I normally present the GEF, because it is very well known within the environmental community, but not that well known outside. Today, we got 2,200 projects in 151 countries with a portfolio size of around $9.4 billion. So we are relatively large. And in 73% of the countries that we work are middle-income nations, in areas where we see that policy coherence is an element that creates, or the lack of political coherence, and I'll explain in a minute what I mean by that, is one key element that establishes a gap within economic growth, social progress, and environmental sustainability. And I think that middle-income nations sit in an intersection. They are on one side driving global growth and economic prosperity, while also facing some of the highest exposure to climate and environmental risks, from, I don't know, water scarcity, pollution, and deforestation, all the way to climate change. And by the way, I want to make an observation, a very gentle, honest, polite observation, because this report, which is fabulous report, concentrate on climate change. And climate change is one of the big environmental challenges. We normally talk about the triple planetary crisis, climate change, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. I strongly believe that there is not three environmental crises, just one. Just one, generated by the rational consumption and production pattern. And that environmental problem is that we are affecting the global system that maintains life in this planet. So for human development, it is as important for us to see the impacts of climate change and how do we revert it and adapt to it, as with the other two big challenges that are associated to the loss of biodiversity and pollution. So when I see this report and many other reports, I kind of see them in a coherent manner. Even though we committed the error 34 years ago to create a convention for climate, a convention for biodiversity, and a convention for pollution or land degradation. Today, more than ever, we need to understand that we need to integrate much better the multilateral environmental agreements. And with that, we can generate more impact. So as I was saying, the middle income countries are fundamental for the effort of human development, and they account for, on one side, for a significant share of global emissions, chemical pollutions, but also loss of biodiversity. Think of Brazil, the custodian of the Amazon rainforest, or South Africa, one of the planet's mega biodiverse region, particularly in flora, or China, whose scale and innovation can shape global pathways. So the GEF has been allocating resources um, for many, many years to 150 countries. We use some very basic indicators for that allocation. One of the good things about the GEF is that it is predictable. Let me do another clarification. The GEF is not a donor to countries. The GEF is not a World Bank, Bretton Woods organization. The GEF is not a UN agency. It has nothing to do with the World Bank and the UN. We are partners. The GEF is a partnership of 187 countries. So it is owned by countries. They operate through a council, which are 32 countries or seats, and they define their investment policies. And this is an agreement within the Global North and the Global South to mobilize financial resources. In order to allocate resources, we had a mechanisms, a methodology whereby we distribute resources based on key indicators. And more and more, the development of more science and better knowledge, like the multidimensional poverty index, enhances our capacity to use the best available data to really pinpoint on those countries. It can be at the country level or the subnational level where they need our key investments so they can become much more resilient to the impacts, not just of climate change, but the other environmental impacts. We got 6 funds in the GEF, so we are a family of trust funds. And this multidimensional poverty index will enhance our capacities to mix it with natural capital indicators, performance indicators, and also very important human development indicators. You know, it is a paradox to me that the GEF allocates resources using one indicator, GDP per capita, where the higher the GDP, the lower the amount of resources we give to that country. But there's a lot of seeds, which are middle income nations, that after a huge, that are extremely vulnerable, and the hurricane comes and makes them go back in terms of human development more than 10 years. So we are adjusting some indicators. For example, the vulnerability indicator should be a very important indicator, and these ones are extremely important, not only for the allocation of resources, but these kind of reports are extremely valuable to us as we measure results. We have a result framework at the GEF, which is the top of the line in terms of technology and knowledge. And yes, we measure the human socioeconomic impacts of our environmental investments. So the benefit of this report is twofold to us, and I think that this is extremely important. My final closing topics here. One, the link between poverty, vulnerability, and environmental challenges is not theoretical. It is a reality for many, many people, and it was already mentioned here when the report was introduced. So environmental degradation, pollution, deforestation now intersect with the daily choices of governments, communities, and households. That's one point. The second point that I want to underline is that environmental degradation amplifies social and economic fragility. Many of the countries that today we rank them as middle-income nations may go backwards in terms of human development because of droughts, because of water lack of water, because of a lack of food security. And lack of food security is not just because of climate change. Loss of biodiversity is a major threat to food systems and food security. So this is why environmental action and what the Jeff does cannot be treated as an afterthought to main development policies. It is in the core of development, and I think that the SDGs really captured that, many years ago. Nevertheless, at the country level, we don't see that reflected when the National Development Plan is being designed and when the budgets are assigned. At the Jeff, we see that well-designed environmental policies can transform vulnerability into an opportunity by improving resource efficiency, protecting nature and the natural capital, and stimulating green growth. I would like to conclude by saying that we need to talk about the global financial gap in terms of human development and the others. We do it a lot on climate. We have kind of an idea what is the global financial gap in terms of nature, in terms of climate at the global and national level. And we tend to believe that mobilizing resources from all sources, particularly from the north to the south, is the way by which we can narrow that financial gap and we will solve all problems. And I don't believe that that's the right appreciation. The way that we can narrow the financial gap and be able to achieve the human development goals and standards, particularly the SDG, is when the executive branch and the way we have organized the executive branch are able to address the lack of political coherence from national development policies. And just let me, to conclude, give you a couple of facts. Today, all countries of planet Earth invest 144 times more public resources in activities and sectors that contribute to climate change than what they invest domestically in reverting climate change. And the second fact that I want to share is that today, all countries invest 144 times more financial resources from the central government in activities and sectors that generate deforestation than what they are investing in reverting the rate of deforestation. So if we are able to align all public and private investment through a new paradigm on how we organize the executive branch, and the executive branch, I mean, the best case is Costa Rica. We don't have a Minister of Energy and Mining and Environment and the Oceans separate. We got them all under one institution. We manage in Costa Rica natural, renewable and non-renewable natural resources in the same institution. We avoid the conflict, the contradiction within agencies of the executive branch. And by doing that, the planning and the budgeting will be aligned with the multilateral development agreements. Some of them are the Rio Conventions or the SDG. So I strongly believe that the lack of political coherence, by far the biggest burden, is not the mobilization of financial resources. Nevertheless, this report highlights some of these elements, and we need to bring them at the country level and generate the proper political dialogues. And I believe that President Carlos Alvarado has that in his working agenda. For us at the Jeff, it's a pleasure to be here. Count with us on this initiative. It is super wealthy to the Jeff to be engaged with the scientists behind this report, because it enhances how we distribute resources and it enhances how we measure the impact that we want to generate. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carlos Manuel, and very much agreeing with you that climate is just one of a broader set of dangerous planetary change that we are confronting. And in fact, that has been something that in the Human Development Report Office we have explored and will continue to explore, including in the 2026 Human Development Report. And Kani, I want to turn to you. Kani Wignaraja is a United Nations Assistant Secretary General, who also happens to be the director for the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific at UNDP. So I want to ask you a question, or maybe two questions, one in each of these two capacities. So as a United Nations Assistant Secretary General, can you share with us a broader reflection, actually building on some of the points that Carlos Manuel made? Is it really the proper way of looking at poverty, climate change, planetary change as sort of separate issues that need to be looked at separately? And how do we bring them together when we have to make decisions on resource allocation? Resources are scarce. There are many priorities. So what does it mean to bring them together? And then secondly, perhaps more in your capacity as a bureau director, one of the findings of the report is that the incidence of overlap between climate hazards and multidimensional poverty is highest actually in South Asia, where for some hazards, 90% of the population living in multidimensional poverty is exposed to one of these climate hazards. So what does that mean, and what can we do, not only in general, but specifically in South Asia, to address this overlapping of the deprivation with climate hazards?
Well, thanks, Pedro, and great to be in this conversation, and always good to follow Carlos, who gives also food for thought. But let me also say congratulations to everyone who worked on this report, which and the data and the analysis really powerful. So to your first question, Pedro, it continues to confuse many of us who've been working in development for so long, that no matter the power of the evidence and the increasing the data behind it worldwide, North and South, that we still just use often this singular measure of income to look at how resources are allocated and how resources flow. Because this is not, we didn't have to wait for this report to understand this. This has just brought it even more starkly to the point that if the report is showing us that 1 in 10 multidimensionally poor people now live in regions exposed to at least one significant climate hazard, right? And that these are no longer even overlapping or sequential. These knocks just keep happening. So it's a everything all at once phenomenon. So I much prefer the terms used in the report, which are concurrent and compounding factors, because they deepen poverty and erode capabilities, resilience, just hope in a future in a different way to income poverty alone. And so it calls for different applications, calls for different instruments or investments and policies. So if I move that then into Asia, and particularly, as you said, if 1/3 approximately of that 1.1 billion multidimensionally poor live in South Asia, I mean, this is a mind-numbing scale, right? If you look at numbers, and then you ask what can be done to reach these numbers, when not everything is in the hands of national entities, right? Or even national policy. So looking at the intensity and regularity of these climate hazards, vast as they are, it's very difficult to see that any single country or even the collection of countries in a sub-regional coalition or regional coalition can handle this by themselves. And this is where the call on global action and global commitment remains so key, and remains where the UN, the IFIs, the Jeff, and others, with the leadership of countries. And we have President of Colombia with us here, have to still keep that global pressure on. But if I take it to a national level, particularly in South Asia, and let me maybe just put 3 instruments that UNDP is working with countries on to try and even make a dent in this, while we try and get our kind of global renewed commitments and actions moving. So one is looking at social protection schemes that are much more shock responsive, and that scale automatically during particular seasons. So during high flood seasons, high heat seasons. And that is something that can at least help in the moment for households going through this. A second instrument is parametric insurance, because for small farmers, for small businesses, and we're seeing this, for example, in India, really being of high value. Again, this adjusts and pays up very soon, and also allows for advances instead of more traditional insurance schemes. And we see state governments and local governments stepping up to help bring down the cost of parametric insurance. And then the various third and is the various almost experimentation still really of various forms of basic income instruments. Some conditional, some less conditional, but in some ways attached to skilling or reskilling, access to health, energy, education, but where basic income schemes really help those individuals and households that are really being hammered by us, by the fact of a better understanding of how these concurrent and compounding factors of poverty and climate really come together. And, if I look at the year before, we had overlaid conflict as well, right? So you've got all of this coming together. So in some ways, and I'll close with this thought, the overall tent is larger, as it should be, of those who need to be covered by these instruments, but with a better understanding and strangely a better targeting. So it seems contradictory that the tent is larger, but it's still a better targeting of who and why are people covered. And it also, I want to say, it responds in part to a question already put in the chat of the hidden poor, and how to get more to them. But Pedro, I'll leave you with this thought. It doesn't address a part of that question, which I thought was really good, which is then the hidden poor due to discriminations and injustices. So I'll leave it there and hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Kani. And
Yes, hold.
I want to turn to President
Instagram
Carlos
hold,
Alvarado
Sabina,
and to
Instagram
pick up
hold.
on one of the points you made, Kani, which is the importance of understanding the fact that prospects for people in many countries depend not only what countries do within their borders, obviously many things depend on what countries do within their borders, but also depend on the way in which we collectively will manage global challenges. And I think the report puts this in sharp relief with the findings that Malika showed, in that the number of poor people exposed, or the intensity of people living in poverty increases with the number of exposure with exposure to a higher number of high heat days, right? So that gradient, right? So in other words, the poorer people are, the more exposed they will be to climate hazards of extreme heat. So President Carlos Alvarado, this is about not only what countries can do within their borders, but how do we manage things collectively? And, you have had a distinguished career in politics, culminating with the presidency of your country, Costa Rica. Since then, you've been a scholar, a thinker, but also an activist on climate. And we're heading to two very important moments in the international community, the COP in Belém and the World Summit on Social Development. So what's your reading, both your political reading, but also your analytical reading of the potential of harnessing these moments to enhance this collective action that is going to be so important, not only to address climate change in itself, but also in the implications that climate will have for people living in poverty looking ahead.
Thank you, Pedro. And I want to congratulate UNDP and OPHI for this work. I'll start with my conclusions and go then to tell you why I think this is so critical and timely. First, why is this report so relevant? Because it helps us see things in a better way and act upon them. And why is that the case? Because we live in this conceptual separation or dualism that affects policymaking in effective action. We still think, and I say this we generally, policymaking, politicians, how budgets act, we think that there's a separation between policies for people and policies for nature or environment. We think that there's an antagonism between growth and nature. There's people still that think that either we do policies for growth, but that inevitably is going to harm nature. And if that we do policies to address nature, climate change, biodiversity, that is going to harm growth. That dualism, that from my perspective is it's faulty, it's incomplete, it's very present when we do public policy, when we debate around the world about these topics. This report bridges that dualism and shed lights on how reality really is. People live in the territory. People live in an environment. I know it sounds like a tautology, but that is the case. Sometimes we forget about that. And if the places where people live are ill, they have a, let's call it not climate change, let's call it they are not healthy, they have a disease, they have extreme heat, they have a tendency to flood, people is going to be affected. And chances are that if people have less resources, and resources is not only money, it could be education, could be safety nets, could be, you name it, access to healthcare, they're going to be way more affected. So this helps us to see things in a different way and integrate the policy that we need to do and the action we need to carry to address in a comprehensive way the situation. There are two words that I want to offer that have not been said a lot in this conversation, but I believe are at the center of it and should become part of the narrative to drive not only the science and the analytics behind the report, but also to drive the action and rally the people to do things. One word is adaptation. This is a central word behind this report. We are in the face of a world that's transforming, is going to affect the lives of people, especially the most vulnerable and poor. So adaptation is critical. And adaptation is not theoretical. It's not, let's say, a myth, because you know that we live in an era of contested realities. But a flooding, a fire, extreme heat is going to affect you whether you or not you believe climate change is a threat. It's going to affect you whether or not you believe we need mitigation in the planet, etc. So adaptation is central. And this report is speaking loud to the reality of adaptation, especially of the poorest across the globe, and giving specifics of what's happening and what's going to happen clearly. And the other word is livelihoods. Livelihoods is how we carry upon our life, hopefully in a sustainable way. We need to build sustainable livelihoods in order to not only preserve our current way of living, but preserve it for the generations to come. So those two words are behind what's at the center of this report. I want to give just an analogy and another further conclusion. I think what we are seeing is it's an analogy of what we're seeing in the study of poverty and environment or climate. it's a little bit what happened in science and biology. When we study the study of life, scientists went to the cell, the building block of life, and studied the cell to define life. Actually, they say a virus is not a cell. It's not life because it's not got the characteristic of a cell. And we started to study the cell. But then also scientists understood that the cell cannot be alive if it's not connected to other cells. So they started to make it more complex. In terms of poverty, it's not only income and the household, it's got to do with other dimensions that make life possible. But going further, scientists and biologists understood it's not only the cells, it's the environment within they live. There is nitrogen, the perfect heat or not, is the rain that make that life possible. Well, it's the same in the case of humans, it's the same in the case of societies. What this report is doing is broadening that scope and giving us a more comprehensive understanding. I want to problematize on another thing. And this is on the definition of the United Nations, because it's about nations. We talk about the nation state. But what this report says is, regardless of the nation or the device that humans we have created historically, poverty and adaptations happens on territories. On Sabina's report is very clear. You can have a country that's an aggregation, but the phenomenon varies in Senegal depending on where you are. So it's not enough to think in terms of nation states. We need to think in terms of the regions, of municipalities, of either the local or ancient leaders of a community. Because, as the word said, one of the most important, there is all adaptation is local. Adaptation do not happen at the multilateral. Adaptation don't even happens at the national level. It happens at the local level. So this needs to problematize our thinking, going beyond the boundaries of the nation state. That's part of perhaps what the reforms the UN needs to enforce. That understand that our role in the multilateral and in the national, it's to empower, envision, energize the local for these transformations, to change the life of people directly in a multi-level governance. So this report also gives the tools for people to address it in that way. So that's why I'm so excited about this. This has to be central, and I really suggest UNDP and OPHI to put it at the center of the agenda in Belém. I really encourage to put it at the center of the agenda in Doha. I really encourage to be at the center of the discussion of the SDGs beyond the 2030 agenda. Because poverty in addressing the climate crisis or the environmental crisis requires one indicator, perhaps that it's not measurable, or not, I have not seen it measured yet, which is intentionality. We have to have the real intention to finish poverty. And we have to be intentional about finishing poverty and adapting where people live so they can face the environmental crisis. And what I've been seeing is that we are not intentional about this, not as we should. We're intentional about making money, about growth, about buying weapons. We're very intentional about that. But we are not intentional about finishing hunger or finishing extreme poverty or adapting the land, the territory for what's going to come and affect, literally, as the report says, almost 1 billion people across the planet, regardless of its north, south, developed, mid-income, LDC, seats. Everybody's going to be affected in some way. So this report has to drive also rally support in a narrative that obliges politicians and decision makers to act and be intentional, to end poverty and to adapt and we live in an era that's cutting aid, it's eliminating. We live in an era that's putting into question whether climate change is a threat or not. So this very clearly rallies people to act on these two dimensions. So I really think it's a remarkable accomplishment, and we need to present it as it is to others and to people, so people can take action on this regard.
Thank you so much, President Alvarado. I think we count on you also to help us to bring this to this fora where the decisions are made. And I think your point about the country boundaries not being necessarily the best unit of analysis is central. And that was a message of the report with the maps that actually don't have country boundaries, precisely to show that a lot of the action happens at the subnational level. I'll go back to all the panelists for final reflections. We have another 15 minutes to go or so. But before that, Sabina, I have a question for you. You alluded in your presentation briefly to changes over time, right? This is something that people are always interested in. Are things getting better, getting worse? And obviously, there are some limitations in the data that we have available to enable us to respond to this question fully. But you essentially said that the data that we have suggests the possibility, perhaps the likelihood of a stagnation in efforts or in progress in reducing poverty. And that is consistent with other evidence that we have, for instance, on the Human Development Index that we found in our latest Human Development Report, that progress was sort of stagnating or evolving very, very slowly at the slowest level ever on record. So can you reflect a bit more on this? Tell us a bit more about what's happening when it comes to changes over time, and perhaps more importantly, what are, in your views, the most important actions that we should be taking if indeed we are facing a context in stagnation in poverty reduction?
Thank you so much, Pedro. Yes, I think before we go to stagnation, we should recognize that historically there has been very strong reduction in multidimensional poverty and a lot to celebrate. So we talked about the climate hazards that are striking South Asia, but South Asia has also been a leader in reducing poverty. In 2005, 55.1% of people in India were poor, and at 16.4% in 2019 to 21. 414 million people leaving poverty. And in Bangladesh, it was 30.5% people being poor in 2014 and 11.5% in 2022. In Nepal, 58% were poor in 2006 and 16.4% in 2022. So we are seeing big reductions in South Asia, but the fastest reductions have tended to be in sub-Saharan Africa in absolute terms. And so the multidimensional poverty goes down when any deprivation of any poor person goes down. So it's very actionable, very tangible. You put a child in school, that deprivation goes down, MPI goes down. So it's a very hands-on, tractable measure. So that's why the stagnation is particularly concerning, although, as I said, it's not enough countries. And we do desperately need up-to-date, high-quality data, especially given the cessation of the Demographic and Health Survey original infrastructure. But what we hope is three things. One is we're coming up to a World Summit on Social Development in Doha. And we hope that out of that summit, there'll be a re-engagement of poverty being multidimensional, covering social integration and livelihoods. We hope for data on livelihoods that Carlos Alvarado stressed to come in to the global MPI if data were available. But also we would hope that, first of all, there would be a moderate MPI for middle-income countries and middle-income areas, low poverty areas, to complement an acute global MPI. And we're working on that with Islamic Development Bank. But second, we want people to consider not just if poverty has been cut by half, which is a relative measure, but also the absolute speed of reduction of poverty. And what I've been sharing has been the absolute speed. Of the global MPI countries, over 30 cut poverty by half. But it's very different if you have very low poverty than if you have very high poverty. So we are hoping that just in terms of recognizing the reduction of poverty, we can sharpen that. And so it becomes predictable and understandable. The second area is in the nexus between climate and poverty. And I really appreciated the different interventions that the esteemed speakers have brought to the fore, but particularly this need for adaptation which isn't thinking about climate change for the children or grandchildren, but for right now, the people who are poor and experiencing a flood lapping into their house today, and will have to repair that, and then another climate change. So one point that really struck me from this research is that if we look at the 887 million people who are poor with one climate hazard, if you only have 1 or 2 climate hazards, then 1 in 7 people are poor. But if you have 3 or 4 climate hazards, then nearly a quarter of the people are poor. So poverty is more acute in the places with more climate hazards. And so I think really adaptation is a vital area. And that means, first of all, having these data, including, as Carlos Manuel said, deforestation, fire, other kinds of deprivations in it. It means updating it regularly. It means disaggregating it. And then, as Carlos Alvarado said, also looking beyond, because heat is a matter of the sun. It's not a matter of political barriers, and floods are a matter of water. So yeah, looking beyond the traditional barriers. And then looking at other data sets to see if everything comes together in language that the climate scientists understand. So for example, for safe and just Earth system boundaries, they also have a parallel finding that South Asia is a hotspot. And I think then we can bring together people with different kinds of expertise, but the value added of bringing a spotlight on the poor and impoverished people, hopefully will mean that those climate scientists can also be energized to put extra effort in reducing climate and poverty in those areas. So I guess that's the hope, that these joined up data will make it very tractable, possible to change, as has been shown in the past. But in a time, as we know, of limited resources, it's going to require commitment, innovation, entrepreneurship, youth coming from the outside, private sector innovating, and different people finding new strategies to address these. And data hopefully can be a common language that will not only bring the problem to bear, but also celebrate where we've been successful at a win-win, reducing both types of hazards.
Thank you, Sabina. And I think one of the powerful implications, or perhaps tools, of the Multidimensional Poverty Index with implications for policy is the fact that it allows us to see where we had poverty reduction and the dimensions of poverty that are sort of lagging behind, right? So if we look at Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, they both had a reduction in multidimensional poverty of about 10 percentage points. But in Africa, the gaps are very much on the infrastructure side, like electricity, water. And in South Asia, they are more on the nutrition side, for instance. So having this multidimensional approach also can guide policy to the kind of interventions that we need to prioritize to accelerate further poverty reduction. So we have 7 minutes or so to go. As I mentioned earlier, we're going back to all of the panelists for one final set of reflections. So if my math is right, that would give about 2 minutes each to share any final thoughts. So maybe we can go in the same order that we followed for the first round of questions, starting then with Carlos Manuel. Final thoughts.
Oh, thank you so much, Pedro. It is for us at the Jeff is kind of a paradox. The fact that many of these middle-income nations, and particularly less developed nations, constantly claim and ask for help with regards to their vulnerabilities to climate change. But their vulnerabilities to climate change today, I mean the flood and the drought, is not happening because there's a power plant using coal generating energy in the global north. It is because they are deforesting and they are destroying their own natural ecosystems at the country level. So this is my point when I talk about the lack of political coherence. You know, I remember 4 years ago that 2 Category 4 hurricanes hit Central America. And I received a call from one president from Central America asking me if they can use the JEF monies to repair the damages of the hurricane. And I said, no, we cannot do that, unfortunately, but we can give you that money, more money, to protect your forest, because the rate of deforestation in your country is making your country even more vulnerable to these extreme weather events. And the president was not connecting the dots within their agricultural policies that promotes land use change, deforestation, with the level of vulnerability. The less forest there is, the more vulnerable you will be. So at the end of the day, we can support these developing countries in many different ways, that if they don't understand and connect the dots within public investments and the management of their natural capital, very little progress in terms of human development we will achieve. And on the contrary, these countries that has done great in terms of human development in the last 2-3 decades can go very quickly backwards where they used to be 2-3 decades ago, because of the unwise management of their natural capital. Nature is the best ally for developing countries in their effort to mitigate, to adapt to climate change, but also in their aspiration for improving the livelihoods of their people. And the fact that they tend to believe that forests are unproductive land, and the landscape should change from forest into cows so they can access the meat market has proven not to be the right way forward. So we constantly, and with UNEP and UNDP particularly, we constantly bring this holistic approach in the projects that we work together with the UN agencies, particularly UNDP, which is the largest implementing agency at the JEF with almost 30% of our portfolio. So that change of mindset is important. And my last point is that, yes, financial support will come from the north, but it is as important as more resources from the north, that the very scarce domestic resources are not doing more damage to nature, which are making the countries more vulnerable. So for me, this is the big paradox that we need to address. Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you so much, Carlos Manuel. And in thanking you, let me also thank the work of the Global Environment Facility. And thank you also for your leadership in really trying to bring together the human and nature, and not seeing this as separate challenges.
Well, Pedro, I'm from the school of Mr. Don Carlos Alvarado, President of Costa Rica. I'm from his school, and he was very clear in his intervention that there is no paradox, there is no dichotomy within nature and human well-being. So I'm the product of that, and he's the expert in this field. Thank you.
We will hear from President Carlos Alvarado. I think Costa Rica is a bit overrepresented on this panel, but it's probably for a good reason. And it reflects the fact that the country was perhaps ahead of others in seeing this connection. Thank you again, Carlos Manuel. Cani, final thoughts?
Thanks, Pedro, and I couldn't agree more with my two fellow panelists on this, on the points that they have made. Just a final reflection from my end is that where the depth or the deeply poor, how far below the poverty line, whether that is both the income poverty line, as many still use it, or when we look at MPI, the fact that the markers for this poverty line still, to me, really are not getting us where we need to go, because living longer while getting either poorer or just being above these lines is still a heavy burden. And there's a very good question in the chat on this, right? So the rethinking of some of the ways in which, including how we live and work and manage our natural assets, and then how we combine some of these instruments is key, because even for the big, vast countries in Asia, whether that is India or Bangladesh or China, there is a sense that there's a whole large group, a population that is stuck at or just above the poverty line. So even when we talk about reducing large numbers, it's not that these people have distanced themselves in the positive direction from this line. and can stay up and stay and keep moving on that journey into a more safer, more prosperous, a more healthy life. So I think we've got to kind of this helps get out of this box of having these lines, and saying, well, you're just below or you're just above the line. And it's more in that journey of moving forward that we've got to see whether that scalability, moving large numbers constantly forward, and that links to both what both other panelists have said, that we've got to look at how particularly we look at our nature-based assets and live very differently with them.
Thank you, Kanye. I think that's a crucial point. We don't have very good data, but some studies suggest that actually the majority of people sort of move in and out of poverty, right? It's not like you have a group of people that stays their entire lives in poverty and another group out of poverty. And I think Carlos Manuel's point are crucial, because essentially what he's saying is that it's more likely that the movement, the net flow, will then move towards people moving more and more into poverty and staying in poverty if we don't look at nature and climate. President Carlos Alvarado, you've been an inspiration to Carlos Manuel and many of us. Final thoughts?
Thank you. No, I think it's the other way around. It was Carlos Manuel that onboarded me on this. But I wanted to again commend the study, the report. It's a great analytical tool product of the best traits that humankind can offer. It's intellect, it's collaboration, cooperation, it's science, but it's a tool. Then it raises another ethical question, because with it, we can see more reality, and we see the reality of millions of people across the planet. So it arises an ethical question when anyone is exposed to this, is what is it that I'm going to do about it? And it's an ethical question we all need to try to answer to ourselves. I always like to quote a physicist called David Bohm, that in 1980, a while back, he said, we should not talk about environment, he said, which sounds a little bit puzzling. But he said, we should not talk about environment because implicitly, if we talk of the environment, it says that there's a separation between us and the environment. And he said, I don't think there's that separation. We cannot live outside of an environment. And you see, that changes the way we think about things. I do believe the most extreme crisis we're experiencing now, it's a crisis of thought. It's a crisis of imagination. The concepts we take for granted are the ones that are putting us at threat. And in the same way, we are connected to that thing we call the environment. It means we are connected to each other. Our fates are connected. No wonder why in different corners of the world there is conflict. It affects us directly. We see it more and more often. So if we are interconnected, not only with the environment, but with each other, whatever we do matters a lot because it affects others. So we can take this tool in a positive way, in an inspiring way, to contribute our part in this big puzzle in a positive way. And I do believe Belém, I do believe Doha and other events are great opportunities to put this tool and narrative into action, into budgets, into targeting, into changing mentalities that may not be the positive ones we need. So that's why the work of all these talented people, I have seen its results in Costa Rica where we implemented and elsewhere. It inspires me and it gives me hope, a real hope grounded in our own agency and action. So that's why I'm hopeful.
Thank you so much, President Alvarado. This idea of intentionality that you now describe by using the word agency is central to the notion of human development. It's about the ability of people to shape their futures and their lives, and hopefully this will be one more instrument that will enable us to do that. Sabine, a final word from you?
I'll just be very brief because the others have touched really on everything, but Carlos Manuel, the need for policy coherence. And so whether we are activists seeing the dissonance and the inconsistencies, or inside the system being able to meld the policy coherence, or with Connie being able to do measures of moderate poverty or to look at transitions, and with Carlos Alvarado, the need for imagination. And the way to address a crisis of imagination is here, in a sense. It's the people here looking at these data, looking at other things, other networks that you have, and thinking of how to do something differently. Because if all of us do a little bit differently, then we'll be able to find some new traction on these issues. And I think when we zoom out and we can see human beings on a shared planet as one problem, and then we see the data that joins it up, then hopefully there will be ways forward. And so I'm very much looking forward to the people here engaging and sharing this work and seeing what comes up. And the door is open on our side as researchers to learn from you, to be criticized, to be challenged, but to try to continue to work on this together very strongly and quickly.
Thank you, Sabine. Well said. So I just want to thank you, Sabine, my colleague Malika, for presenting the results, to our acting administrator, Haoliang Xu, to the panelists, Carlos Manuel, Carlos Alvarado, Cani. And again, we do these reports not for the sake of reports, right? We do these reports to have some impact. And so now I'm looking at all of you following us now live, and those that will see this recording later, to join us in making sure that these findings make a difference in people's lives around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.